The gift of limits. And that may sound really odd because limits, it just sounds so, limiting or something. I mean, it's just who wants to be limited? But this is what I'm going to try to argue is that limits are actually a gift from God. And it's important for us to embrace them and to understand scripturally and spiritually how that impacts our life. When our kids were younger, when they were still living at home, all of our kids are gone, by the way. It's a great feeling. We had some linger here and there and come back, and the boomerang, right? You've heard that before. But they're all gone now. But when they were younger, and we had all kinds of limits for them. Limits about where they could go and with who and how late and what their behavior is supposed to be like and how they communicate, all those kind of things. And as they got older, we reduced some of their limits. And then when they become adults and on their own, they just said, woohoo, no more limits. Right? At least that's what they thought. And chaos ensued, obviously. But limits are actually a gift. They're actually a gift that God has given to us. And we don't always understand that or appreciate that. And this is part of what we're talking about this series, emotionally healthy spirituality. And over the course of, we're almost done, one more Sunday and we're done this series. But over the last few weeks, we've been learning about these principles that are necessary for us to have emotionally healthy spirituality in our lives. And so on the screen, you'll see some of these principles. We've talked about accepting the fact that we've been given gifts from God, given the gift of emotions from God, because God is an emotional God, and we are created in His image. And so He feels, we feel. We talked about living faithful to yourself, that God has given us a unique life to live, and not disconnecting from other people, not being isolated, but just living faithful to who God created you in relationship with other people. We talk about going back in order to go forward. It takes a lot of courage to do this. It's not something that's enjoyable, but going back, recognizing some of the brokenness in our life in order for us to be able to move forward rather than being stuck in our past. And going back means also recognizing there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering and sorrow in our life. And so we have to enlarge our soul through grief and understand how that works. And then last couple of weeks we've talked about loving well. We talked about getting off our horse, right? Entering into somebody's world and holding on to ourselves in that process and the difficult tension that exists between those two worlds, of hanging between these two worlds. And then finally, we're going to be looking at today, if we're going to fulfill the purpose that God has for our lives, we're going to have to understand the limits that are there. And so these are principles that build on each other as we've been going through the last several weeks. And they're all interconnected with each other. So in order to be free from the past, you're going to have to go back and deal with that brokenness so you can be set free from the past. And in order for you to be a loving person, you're going to have to be able to know how to grieve those losses. I mean, you can't do this with just selecting one or two of these. They all are interconnected with one another. And today, of course, we need to recognize that if we don't embrace the limits in our life, we're going to burn out. Probably, let me give you an example of that. Probably many of you are familiar with the VeggieTales children's video series. And this is something that came out about 20 years ago. And if you have children, young children, or if you have grandchildren, probably have come across this before, because these are all animated vegetables that love Jesus. It's great. And when they first came out, I liked it. I mean, I watched it with my kids, and we even went to the movie theater. They had the movie Jonah came out, all about the pirates that didn't do anything, and I thought that was fantastic. And really enjoy this whole video series. And a few years ago, Christianity Today had an article about the creator of the VeggieTales series, Phil Vischer. And when he was 21 years old, he had this vision of creating this animated children's video series. And he didn't have any money at the time, but he really felt it was God that was pushing him to do this, and so he borrowed some money, and he created his first episode back in 1993, around Christmas time, and it was a hit. And over the next 10 years, he developed more and more episodes, and Within 10 years, he sold 25 million videos, and he had a huge following all around the world, including myself. And he went from one person to 210 employees and created this great big entertainment company that he felt was going to rival Walt Disney, but it would be for God. And he talked about how God was providing for him and the miracles that were happening along the way. About 6 years into this thing, around 1999, things started going wrong and bad. He started to overspend. He started to overexpand, and he was borrowing a multi-million dollars to keep him going forward. But then he got sued for a breach of contract when he changed distribution companies, and he wasn't able to settle out of court. And so he had to pay out $11 million, and he went bankrupt. That's what happened. And so Big Ideas, the company which he created, was sold off to the highest bidder. He lost all of his employees. He lost his house. He lost everything as a result of that lawsuit. In the last 3 or 4 years of this dark time, when he was experiencing the greatest amount of stress, financial stress, he was starting to get ill, like physically sick from all the stress that he was experiencing. And he was no longer doing the things that he loved doing. Like he wasn't writing, he wasn't drawing, he wasn't creating anything. He was just so overwhelmed and stressed out. And he tried to build an empire like Walt Disney. And in the interview, he said, "I was trying to be someone that God did not call me to be, and that God did not create me to be. I realized that I was pursuing cultural influence when I should have been pursuing God." And his wife in the interview said this, "God let us fall. And the last 6 months have been the best Phil and I have had in 10 years. And shortly after that, he went to Walt Disney. And he put his hand on the statue of Walt Disney, and he says, "I'm done now. You can be you, and I will be me." So Phil Vischer, he had a sense of what God was calling him to do. But he did not understand his limitations. He did not deal with the limits in his life, and that limits are actually a pathway to contentment. And I believe this is one of the most difficult things for us to really grapple with. We don't want to accept and embrace our limits. We don't want to deal with those things because it just doesn't make sense. But we understand the concept of limits. I mean, I can say, you put on there 1,000 pounds, and I won't be able to lift that. We all understand that we have limits. But yet we struggle with reflecting on these limits as it relates to our spirituality. So we're going to talk about John the Baptist. John the Baptist is a person in the Bible that understood his limits. He is somebody that was content and full of joy in embracing the limits that he had. And this is so rare in our culture today. Very few Christians walk in this kind of contentment and rest. So when John the Baptist came on the scene, it was kind of an introduction to something that had been gone for at least 400 years, where God was silent and no true prophet of God had been speaking to the nation of Israel. And then John the Baptist comes along and he starts preaching in the wilderness, and people started to recognize that he is something special, that he actually is a prophet of God. And so they came flocking to him. So hundreds and even thousands of people came to see and hear John the Baptist. And then around that time, Jesus also started his ministry. And some of the disciples that were following John the Baptist started to see and hear what Jesus was doing, and so they started leaving John the Baptist and going to hear Jesus. And some of the core group of John the Baptist were saying, "Hey, John, we've got a problem. That Jesus character over there, he's stealing our sheep. They're going over there. We're losing, and he's going up. Something's got to be done." And so these disciples of John, they didn't really probably realize what they were doing. They were trying to incite John to some kind of jealousy. And John could have responded with jealousy. He could have responded with bitterness about what's happening, that somebody else has got going on there. And this is what John did. He did not respond in that way. And this is what he says in John 3, starting at verse 27. To this John replied, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. So he knows his limits. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah, but I'm sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater, I must become less. John, this is a remarkable thing. John was full of joy. There was joy that was flooding into his heart and he was content with the fact that he wasn't the person that should be recognized. It's God, it's Jesus, the Messiah. And so I want to talk about that. How is it possible that limits can be a pathway to contentment? Because there's so little peace that we have in our culture. But John is content. He's peaceful, even in the midst of conflict. Because shortly after this, John was arrested and was killed. And he was a blessing presence, even in the midst of all of that chaos. So, what's the pathway? Here's the pathway. Number one, we need to embrace our limits. Embrace your limits. This is what John does. And I just want us to pause and reflect on that first verse again. In verse 27, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. John understands that there are limits that we all have in our lives. And John is saying, it's true. I understand that I'm not the most popular prophet out there right now. I recognize that there are some limitations about who I am. Yes, I know that I don't have the big house, and I don't have cable TV, I don't have internet. I'm wearing these funny, scratchy clothes and preaching out in the wilderness and eating this strange food. And yes, I know that my life is going to be short. I know I'm never going to fall in love and get married and have kids. And John is saying all these things. He's recognizing that he is content in knowing these limitations about who he is. And his followers are not content at all. And in verse 29, he says, I'm just the best man. That's all I am. I'm just here to attend to the details because the real party is for the bridegroom. I'm just here to make him look good. That's my purpose in life. It's about Jesus. It's his time. I must decrease and he must increase. And so he embraces this and he trusts in God that this is his role. This is who he is designed to be. So I want to ask the question, why are limits so difficult to embrace? Why do we struggle with this so much? You know, as I mentioned, when Laura and I had 3 boys and no girls, so there was all kinds of testosterone going on in our family, much to Laura's chagrin. And testosterone and stupid seem to go together sometimes. We would do all kinds of these, how much can you lift, and, well, let's do this. And so I can do that. Oh, yeah, I can lift 200. Oh, that's nothing. I can lift more than that. And then sooner or later, at my age, of course, you pull every muscle that's left in your body and you can't even function the next day. It's a lot of stupid. Yeah, my son's smiling he knows exactly what I'm talking about. So why is it? I hate those limitations. Why do we have this? Why do we not embrace those limits? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, our egos are so inflated. We struggle with this because we act as if we're God. We act as if we can do anything, that we can fix anything, that we can accomplish anything. And we have these fantasies about ourselves that we're so big and so grandiose that really don't fit into real life. And so a couple of things can happen. Either we get manic and crazy and grandiose and we think that we can do whatever it is that needs to get done, but then we get hurt or we hurt other people in the process. Or the other response is that we get depressed because we get overwhelmed with, we hit this limit. We just can't actually do it. And so we just kind of give up and we get depressed and we just kind of give up as a result. It's like the Garden of Eden when God placed Adam and Eve in the garden. He says, The only limit that I'm presenting to you is that don't eat of that tree. And what if, of course, Satan comes along and he encourages them to cross that limit. He says, you won't die. What will happen is that you will be like God. And that's exactly what is a temptation for us. We all want to be like God. We don't want limits. We want to be able to exceed those limits. And so whenever we cross over the limit, we are entering into the enemy's territory. And so one of the things that happens is that when we deny our limits, when we ignore those limitations in our life, we start dominating people, we start controlling them, we start manipulating them, we get aggressive, we blame other people, or we get burned out. We get all stressed out with all this anxiety in our lives that we can't do it. And as a result, we make other people pay. Well, I've done that many times to my wife, stressed all out. And who pays? It's my wife that pays. Or we become workaholics and we can't imagine the world running without us. So this is big. The second reason why we struggle with limits is that our identity is so wrapped up in what other people are thinking. And it's hard for us to say no. In Proverbs 29, it says, the fear of human opinion disables. It disables us. It's a trap. But trusting in God protects you from that. So if we're looking for approval from other people, it's a trap. It will just destroy us. Even in little things, like somebody says, hey, come on out, I want to party tonight because I've been working so hard. And you've already been out 3 nights that week. And you say, okay, well, I don't want to say no to you. So I go out and we see a movie and go to Wings afterwards. And then we get home late. And then I guess wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning the next day to go to work. And I'm tired and I'm grouchy. And I'm mad at that person for asking me to come out. So even in little things, when we don't recognize our own limits, can cause problems. So when you cross the line that God has placed in your life, you end up in the territory of the evil one. And this is why the temptation of Jesus was so important. This is why it's such a big deal. Jesus he limits himself to a human being limitless God, and he purposely, intentionally, voluntarily becomes human, limits himself. And so what does Satan do? He comes to Jesus and he wants him to cross that limit. He takes him out to the wilderness and he says, Jesus, why don't you turn these stones into bread? Why don't you jump off this temple? And he's trying to cause him to cross these limits, to get him off of the limits that God has placed in his life, and therefore destroy Jesus and his ministry and his reputation. And so we have this thing inside of us that we hate limits. We try to cross that line all the time. And really, it's because of our egos. It's part of our constant desire to please others. And we say, I can do it, I can do it. To help us think a little bit more about this, I've got 10 different things of limits that are naturally part of everybody's life. And these aren't exhaustive, these are just things that would be helpful for you to reflect on, maybe during a devotional time to think about. But here are 10 limits. First of all, we're human. We have physical limits, and these are all in your insert in your bulletin as well. We have physical bodies. Our bodies are decaying. They will turn to dust. You need sleep. That's a limit. If you don't get sleep, you'll die. There are limits in our biochemistry and our genetic makeup. As we're getting older, it doesn't matter how many plastic surgeries you have, you will continue to get older and eventually die. Isn't that an encouraging message? I know, that's my goal in life, is encourage all of you. Some of you don't like your physical features. You wish to be taller or shorter or fatter or skinny. Well, I'm not sure if you want to be fatter, but who knows? You might. There's all kinds of limitations on our bodies physically. Family structure. You were born in a certain structure. You may have just had a mother or just a father, or you've had both. There are limitations in how they raised you. There are limitations in the quality of the relationship that you had with them. And no matter how great your family was, there were limitations. Your parents had limitations. They couldn't do everything. Every family has a certain amount of capital in terms of their wealth and their ethnicity, their culture, where you're born, all those things. Those are limits. Marital status is a limit. If you're married, it's a limit. If you're single, it's a limit. If you have children, that's a limit. If you're childless, that's a limit. The kind of children you have can be a limit. Intellectual capacity is a limit. I don't care if you have a photographic memory. You can't go to the local library and read and memorize every book in that library. You can't be proficient in every area of life. That's a limit. Talents and gifts, we all have them given to us by God, but there are limits at which we can use those talents. I wish I could run the 4-minute mile, but I will never, no matter how obsessed I am of wanting to run a 4-minute mile, I'll never be able to do it. I can't even run an 8-minute mile. There is material wealth. And I know that many of you are extraordinarily wealthy, but you're keeping it a secret. You don't want anybody to know. That's kind of a joke. I don't know. By the silence, I think I'm actually true. I mean, this is actually happening. This is great, All right. Work and relationships. That's a limit. Genesis 3 makes it very clear that there is a curse on our work, and no matter how great your job is, no matter how wonderful it is for you to get up every morning and go to work, there is a limit there because you will never be completely satisfied and fulfilled in the job that you have. Same thing in our relationships. You can have a wonderful relationship, but even there is a limit to how fulfilling that relationship will be on this side of heaven. And so you will always have a component of frustration to that. Even if you are a people person like me, you like enjoying spending time with people. In my phone, I have roughly 2,000 contacts of people that I've gotten to know over the last 25 years in the various churches I've been in. But there's very few people that I wish happy birthday to, because you imagine 2,000 people wishing them happy. You just cannot have a personal relationship with a number of people. Jesus only had 12 disciples and mentored 3 of them. Even he was limited relationally. The raw material that we have, the raw material that God has given us, my temperament, my personality, my motivation, all of that has limits. Time is running out. I only have one life to live. I mean, I would love to study and become a doctor. That was the other choice, pastor or doctor, who knows. And but maybe a psychiatrist. I actually like working with my hands too, like being a mechanic and working. I have woodworking tools too, and I mean, I would love to be able to do all that. I would love to travel. I want to see, Russia and Africa and Greece and Turkey. I mean, there's all kinds of places I want to go to. There's so many things that I would love to be able to do, but I can only be one person, live one life. There's limits to what we can do. And number 10, my knowledge of God. I'm limited in my understanding of who God is. The Bible says there are secret things that belong to the Lord our God. Or for our God is in the heavens and he does as he wishes. There's a mystery to God that I don't have it all down pat. I don't understand everything. So there's so much that I don't know. There's a mystery to life that I'm finding out. So embracing our limits is a challenge. But this was the path of Jesus. Imagine, again, reflect on that. The limitless God. I mean, we can't even fully comprehend that. God doesn't even have to lift a finger. All these movies about these superheroes like Captain America and the Avengers. And I mean, having a movie about God as the hero would be really boring because there would be no challenge, right? I mean, God doesn't have to worry about an enemy trying to challenge him because there is no challenge. God speaks the worlds into existence. And Jesus comes and purposely and intentionally, voluntarily becomes human with all the limitations that I've just described. And for 30 years, he saw death and disease and people dying all around him, and he did not do any miracles. It must have required an incredible amount of courage and power for him to not exercise who he is as the limitless God. And so he didn't just embrace his limits, he surrendered to them as well. And that's the second part, that we need to surrender to our limits. And this is what John the Baptist did. You can fight them if you want. Just like I try to fight them when my kids come over and say, hey, let's lift 300 pounds or something, see how much you can do. And I fight that. It says, yeah, I can do that for sure. And I get hurt. And so surrendering to our limits is not a passive thing. It's an active thing. It requires a great deal of purposefulness, of willingness to enter into a time of prayer and determination and surrendering to what God has called you. And so it's saying, God, you're good. You're in control. You're going to handle the universe. I recognize that I have everything that I need, and you're going to use me whatever way that you want. And so I'm not going to be arrogant. I'm not going to be idolatrous. I'm not going to try to handle everything on my own. And so it's an attitude of prayer and surrender, believing and trusting in God that He loves me and He wants the best for me, and He's using me for His purposes. And so when I hit these limits, and when I get rejected, from I don't get this job, or I don't enter into this university, or this relationship doesn't work out, or this wealth doesn't come into my life, and I recognize these are limits in my life, and I say, God, you have your best interests. You have my best interests as mine. I'm trusting in you, whatever occurs. So I wish I could change people. I wish I could change, the people that I'm working with, or my spouse, or my children, but I can't do that. And so you trust God. The Serenity Prayer is something that has been read at 12-step programs for many years. It was written by a Christian theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1940s. And the original prayer went like this. It says, God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. And there is that phrase that sometimes gets left out, God, give us grace. God, give us grace. We need this. And I don't think that this prayer is just for alcoholics or drug abusers. This is for humans. This is for all of us. We all need this. We need a human anonymous. Well, let's call it we all need it. Human anonymous. Because, I'm Richard, and I'm human. I'm limited. I'm a prideaholic. And we need to recognize that we have limitations. Here's a definition of humility. It's knowing your limits and asking for help when you need it. Knowing your limits and asking for help. That's a great definition. Part of us simply does not want to surrender to these limitations. And we get overloaded financially, physically, emotionally, and there's no rest there. We get depleted and exhausted. And our culture is constantly pulling us into this. And they're advertising. It's all about getting the envy and the greed in our lives. We see what other people have. We see the kind of house that they have. We see what kind of car they drive. We see some of the toys that they have, and their wealth and their health and their, all the money and all the things that they have. And we start to see all of that and says, well, why can't I have that? And we get envious about things that we didn't even know existed until they got revealed to us. And it's all about this greed, and we're living in an age of envy. And it's creating this desire in us to want what it shouldn't be ours. And so we need to get to the point where we are willing to enter into the joy of our limitations. So if we're going to be content like John and like Jesus, we embrace our limits, we surrender to our limits, and then we enter into the joy of our limits. There is joy in knowing that I can't do it all, that I wasn't designed to do it all. It's not for me to do this. This is really an invitation for contentment, an invitation to be calm, to be centered, to be a blessing presence in the midst of challenge. This is true faith, because you leave the world into the hands of God. And you're not trying to be God. You let God run the universe. And you say, a man or a woman can receive only what is given to them from heaven. That's a place of faithfulness and rest. And so as we close off the service this morning, I want to ask you this question. What are you trying to prove? This is a question you ask yourself. What are you trying to prove? What are you so anxiously striving for where you've lost your rest? What is it in your heart that you know is pushing through your limits? This is a hard question for us to ask. And we're not going to do a Q&A this morning. I want to invite you to have a dialogue with people around you and to share some of the limits that you are struggling with in your life right now. Because we all have limits that we are probably pushing through, and it's causing us to lack rest, to lack contentment and peace in our lives. And so I'm going to invite you to do that. We're going to have, at 11 o'clock, we're going to have Tim share his story with us. But we have a few minutes before that. And so before we close, I'm going to have Peter and his group come up and lead us in a song. And then we're going to have that little bit of time for us to just dialogue with one another and to talk about that and then share. And share that limitation and then pray with one another. So let's close in prayer. Father, I thank you for this text. I thank you that we affirm that what you have said, that a person can only receive what has been given to them from heaven. And I pray that we would humble ourselves and that we would repent of those things in which we are trying to cross over the limits and enter into the enemy's territory. And may we rest from that anxiety. May we rest from our striving and trying to make the world happen, and that we would embrace the gift of our limits. And we recognize that this is rebellion, that there's something deep within us that raises up a fist against you. And it's pride, it's inflated ego, it's grandiosity. And Father, there's many of us here this morning that need to repent from that. And so God, give us the grace that we need to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. In Jesus' name, amen.